By way of introduction, self-introduction, if you could each tell me a little bit about what your role was on that first campaign, obviously at 3 very different levels, but I think it'll help set the parameters here.
Well, I think Jimmy Carter was lucky because he had the 2 of us to carry out Hamilton's plan.
That's it. That's it. Yeah. When did he sign up?
I don't know.
No. It's, the governor, in his campaigning for other Democratic candidates, tried to organize meetings after an event. And I think he did this across the country with people that, by political contacts.
Hold on.
It's on.
Yeah, but you got to get it higher up here. You're all bound up here.
Wouldn't want any of this to be lost to history.
That's right.
Somebody once said, you know, I used to have an engineer that traveled around with me that knew how to do all this, but then he got elected president, and so.
That's right. Well, I think in my case, it was representative of a lot of cases, as Governor Carter and Jody Powell traveled around the country in 74 and 75. And as Jody mentioned, Hamilton had worked with the Democratic National Committee, and he wasn't up there just to have a good time in Washington, which he did, but he also was looking for names and making contacts. And at the end of one such fundraiser in Albuquerque, New Mexico, about 10 of us got together after the banquet and listened to Governor Carter talk about what he intended to do in 1975. And he was not going to test the waters. He was not going to see how it worked out. He was not going to form an exploratory committee. He was going to announce for the presidency in 1975, and he was going to enter every primary and caucus, and he was going to work hard, and he did not intend to lose. Those were his words. Well, that struck a chord with a lot of people, I think. That plus his just obvious intelligence and dedication to the issues that a lot of us hope the Democratic Party could promulgate. So that roped me in. It certainly roped in another young man from New Mexico by the name of Chris Brown, and we ended up performing various roles, but eventually we would be campaign coordinators in the state of Iowa and in the state of New Hampshire. And in moving throughout the Midwest and the western states, in early 1975, I would meet people like Scott Burnett and Dennis Tapsack and a number of other people who had already heard Governor Carter speak, or they knew of him through friends, and the movement kept growing in terms of people that wanted to help him out.
Yeah, I met Jimmy Carter in Topeka at the annual Democratic dinner on March 29th, 1975. Jimmy and Rosalind and this guy Jody Powell. And about 3 weeks later, we had the State Young Democrats Convention, and this guy shows up. A bunch of, I remember that Scoop Jackson, Henry Jackson, had an organizer come in from Denver. Tim Kraft came in for Carter, and boy, you're lucky you got me.
Yeah,
I could have put Scoop Jackson in the presidency.
Well, I wasn't the candidate.
But I started, my friend Dennis Tapsack and I were running buddies, and we started volunteering on the weekends to go with Jimmy Carter if he was going to be in Kansas or Missouri or Nebraska. And Tim came in occasionally. We talked a lot by phone, and I thought Carter had the right message and the intelligence, and I really was lucky to be with him.
If you permit a small aside about that,
sure.
that 74 campaign, that on election night, Governor Carter spent all night making calls to candidates. The people he called were all the candidates that lost, because those are the ones that nobody was going to call. and who would appreciate getting a call. And I'd love to know the percentage of those folks that ended up being early supporters, but I guarantee there's a bunch of them.
That's great. So there was a new system in place, new nominating system in 1976 that actually did make the caucuses in Iowa and that early New Hampshire primary even more important than in the past. How did the Carter campaign kind of seize that opportunity? We've already heard Jody talk a little bit about how there was an idea that Carter's style and politics might resonate there.
Well, those were the first two contests.
Yeah.
And I think that Hamilton Jordan, I always think in terms of Governor Carter and Jody Powell and Hamilton Jordan. It's hard to distinguish between the contributions of the three. They put their heads together and decided that they were going to go all out in Iowa and New Hampshire. And I remember reading a Gary Hart book about the McGovern campaign in Iowa.
Right.
And they thought that Iowa was important. Not that many people in the National Press Corps picked that up, but Gary Hart wrote a book called Right from the Start. And he talked about the efforts that they made in Iowa with a young organizer from Wisconsin by the name of Gene Picorni, and that the caucuses allowed McGovern's type of appeal and his anti-war stance and his hard work in grassroots organizing to pay off. Well, excuse me, Muskie won the Iowa caucuses, but McGovern came surprisingly close. And I'll never forget this part of Gary Hart's book. He said that the morning after the Iowa caucuses, Bill Lawrence, who was a national political correspondent for ABC News, said that Senator Muskie's presidential campaign ran off an icy road in Iowa last night.
Right.
And Hart said that we would have paid $2 million for that sentence.
But in 1968, how was the national delegates selected? I don't know that. McGovern was the first time there was caucuses were important. Was it party bosses in 68, 64?
Not so much in Iowa. But you have to remember, when you go back to 1960, John Kennedy ran in all of 6 primaries.
That's it.
6 primaries. And the rest of the delegate selection was done by the state party apparati.
Right.
And for the most part, state chairman and as you say, bosses. Governor Carter used to call them leaders if they're with me, bosses if they're against me.
Well, I mean, the short answer is that by 76, the nominating process was much more small d democratic and much more proportional representation, much more powerful voice from individuals as opposed to the political leadership in the states.
Yeah, and those reforms that the young campaigners came out of 72 with were actually implemented. So
That's right.
Yeah, so these
That's
delegates
right.
were apportioned. Who were the three of you most concerned about among the other Democratic candidates? From an outsider like me, it seems like the strategy was to eliminate major rivals one by one, and I looked this up. George Wallace in North Carolina, Scoop Jackson in Pennsylvania, Mo Udall in Wisconsin, and then Jerry Brown kind of comes on in the end. Was this the strategy, and who were you most concerned about on the Democratic side?
Well, I don't know. I defer to Jody on that in terms of a national strategic level. It seemed to me we just took it state by state.
Okay,
And,
one day at a time.
Yeah, one day at a time. And in Iowa, Mo Udall was very popular there. I mean, his political stance and his political demeanor and personality lent itself to good support in Iowa. What he did, however, was he chose 2 sort of distinctly factionalized people as leaders of his campaign in Iowa. And so people sort of identified him with the very liberal wing of the Democratic Party.
Okay.
And Governor Carter, in choosing an outsider who just looked for help from all sides of the political spectrum, in this case myself, we were able to assemble a steering committee that represented a broader base than Udall was able to achieve. Scoop Jackson didn't even compete in Iowa. Birch Bayh came in October or November.
Way too late.
Yeah, was sort of a, you know, I'm Senator Bayh, and you're lucky to have me. And anyway.
That goes over great in Des Moines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I always thought, I agree with, to the extent, it was, we're going to be everywhere, so
Right.
we had to take on whoever showed up that night. But that, in my view, there was, in terms of the nomination itself, probably Mo Udall was the most serious challenge.